Hi, I'm Mason Chaudhry, the CTO at Agile Solutions. I'm excited that you can join us today on a really important topic that you're finding in commercial and mission-driven organizations, and that is the topic of value. More than ever, especially post-pandemic, as we look at a possible economic downturn, organizations are trying to determine if their investments really are bringing value, if their migrations are bringing value, if their changes in their operating model, moving to agility, moving to product centricity, is bringing value. So what we're looking to do in a few conversations is really tackle what value means at different levels and to different customers. In order to do that, I will be joined by Reed Lowry, who is an Agile domain expert, brings a lot of experience not only in technology, but on the business side. And I myself, as CTO of Ixion, Mason Chaudhry, also have experience not only on the technology side, but on the process improvement side. So with that said, let's get started. Today, first topic we're going to discuss is, what does value really mean? Is value dollars and cents? Is value driving something across the finish line? In that, my first question to you, Reed, becomes, what is value and at what levels?
Thanks, Mason. It's a pleasure to be here. So one of the things that we want to try and examine is what does that actually mean to different levels within the organization. So value at different perceptions is something within scope for various people. So when we look at teams, value that we measure them on is working software. When we look at the program level or a consolidation of teams, we're looking at working features. In other words, they're well integrated, they're actually functioning as designed and meeting the perceptions of our stakeholders and businesses that have asked us to do this. And then from the portfolio or the executive level, the products that we're chartering and funding, are they actually working? So those at different levels, those are the values. But the most important thing to look at here is, when we start measuring these things, what does that really mean? So quality metrics are some of the things that we instantiate when we start doing this. At Teams, one of the things we look at is zero defect delivery. And the reason we do that is the average in the industry for rework, and that's quality-based rework, is somewhere near 23%. So think of that. For every dollar you spend, a quarter goes back to doing it right again. And that's a huge amount of money. So we want to trim that down initially and get the teams to a point where there's no defects escaping from the team. When we look at the program, again, as teams integrate their zero defect software, we want to make sure that it's integrated and doesn't compound anything that's been hidden legacy-wise within our code. And then ultimately, from the executive level, are we building things that people are adopting? If we don't do that, what ends up happening is we're building things for the sake of building things. And there's tons of software out there that have hidden features that people are not even aware of. And so that adoption or perception of value that was designed never gets fully capitalized.
And we're going to take a deeper dive on that last statement you made, where folks are not getting the most out of their technology. But you mentioned legacy, and a lot of organizations have shifted from waterfall practices to agility. They are shifting to product-centric practices, funding value streams. And all of this, there's a lot of high hope and a lot of assumptions. Organizations believe, for example, Reed, that if you go agile, you're cutting costs. What's the reality there?
Well, the reality is you're cutting costs by doing it defect-free. So one of the things we want to make sure is that zero defect. So if you have to go back and that 23% is spent on doing it right the second time, that's a waste of money. So we want to be defect-free.
Then the next assumption, and you hear this one a lot, is if I go agile, I will reduce headcount.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about that is people assume we can get more done with less people. And the reality is you've trained these people, and the average in the industry is $60,000 to $70,000 to get somebody to that level that you needed to begin with. Why reduce headcount, even if it's contract based? Why reduce it, but redirect that mind share that has already adopted your concepts and things that you built within your workspace and move them to new efforts so they don't have to relearn things.
Agreed. And then one of the most common agile and product assumptions is that, you know what, we go down those paths that we will decrease time to market no matter the industry. What's the
Yeah.
reality there?
Yeah, that always makes me laugh because everybody still wants all or nothing. And that's historic legacy. We don't look at delivering all. What we look at is delivering the highest value items that function, that stand alone. The common term in the industry is minimum viable product. In other words, we deliver what really works as quickly as possible.
Yeah. And so then in Agile, there are some folks think that's Agile is a synonym for Scrum,
Right.
and Scrum training and Scrum will be the end all be all.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you go back to Agile's foundation, so Agile is situated on top of all of the lean practices. And if you go back to lean back in the 80s, what was it focused on? Kanban. So what's interesting, that's first in, first out, or highest priority in, and that's first out. So Kanban, there's large scale Scrum, there's all sorts of different ways to implement Agile. So it's not a cut and dried cookie cutter that you put in place, but what you do is figure out what works in your organization, then replicate that as you can.
And then the training and the roles, true value comes from having most roles, if not all roles, understanding what their path is to agility.
Absolutely right. So one of the early mistakes a lot of companies make is, oh, we just need a trained scrum master. And the reality is you need trained product owners, you need trained teams, and then you need executives and business stakeholders that are going to become your leaders in agility. They need to be trained so that they walk the talk and ask for the things that the company really needs that are agile based from the people that are trying to make this transformation.
Read most folks that go down the agile path, first thing they learn are user stories. Is that the
Right.
only format for value?
Well, it's interesting because teams will constantly say, oh, well, that doesn't fit a user story format. And it's like, that's okay. What we want to know is what's the intent and what's the benefit. So, however you want to structure that, that makes sense. That's the important thing. What is the ultimate benefit if you do it right? And I always ask that question when we're defining the story. How do I know if you do this, you got it right?
Yep. And the next one of my favorites, because I hear it all the time. Hey, we've got DevOps. We've got DevOps. What are folks missing about DevOps?
Well, DevOps is a mindset. So the whole, and similar with Agile, Agile is a mindset. It's not a set of tools. It's a mindset that certain tools will help foster. Same thing with DevOps. DevOps is a complete mindset. We want to think from beginning to end. How do we move this so that not only operations is part of the process, but engineering and operations are working together, integrated, so that they can do the things together.
Yeah, and the last one is a critical assumption that you see in so many enterprises that
Yes.
agility is in IT. What do I need with agility? I'm on the business side.
Right. So the problem is if you're outside of the box and it's only IT that's doing agility, you're going to ask for things that are unreasonable and it's going to undermine their efforts. What's even worse is further up the chain as we try to report on value and try to report on progress, legacy questions and legacy reporting are still expected, and that undermines the process and the progress that the teams are making.
Yeah, so read everything that we've talked about, these assumptions, a lot of it's seen at the team or middle layer. One of the
Right.
biggest disconnects we hear from our customers and organizations we work with is that we have gone agile on the bottom,
Right.
but up top, there's an absolute disconnect in the way leadership reports, budgets, communicates. So let's talk about that. If you truly want to bring value in your organization, you have to be unified in your approach and unified in how you look at the outcomes. What have we seen traditionally?
So teams always get trained first because they're the ones that are writing the code or producing the hardware, et cetera. And that ultimately it seems to be enough for most organizations. But the problem with that is now you've got a bunch of people that are executing on a new way of doing things. Then there's this lack of understanding in the middle, as well as a complete disconnect at the executive level. So what we want to encourage is to invert that. One of the ways we do that is we start talking the talk with executives even before we start working with teams. And the reason behind that is they're going to have to change their expectations on what they're asking for reporting, for status, et cetera. And as they learn some of these new ways of asking for things, this cultivates the culture that you really need to build within an agile transformation environment.
And that's interesting because that is one of the biggest issues that's pretty universal. Fortune 100, federal agencies, academia is how do you connect leadership and communication all the way down?
Right.
So when we do speak to leadership, Reed, one of the questions that I personally receive a lot is, what should I be quantifying when I look at value, and how should I do it in an agile operating model? In the past, executives had very straight milestones and KPIs. Hey, I've spent X amount of money to kick off this project. The project was delivered on this day. But really not gauging if that project that you delivered actually brought value to the end user or the customer. And when you look at customers, a lot of folks say, hey, it's easy to determine value for an external customer. We built a platform for our customers or members. They're utilizing it by 50% more than they were before. There's value. But when it comes to the internal part of an enterprise, a lot of organizations struggle with what value is. Help us understand what point in time measurement means in value from a few different viewpoints.
Sure. So one of the things that we need to cultivate is value, much like a photograph, is a point in time measurement. It's always moving. So when we take a picture, ultimately that's a 1 millisecond in time where we've actually got that, and it changes. The point in time measurement, when we talk about value in an organization, these metrics are not unusual, but they should be more of a focus. So when we look at what teams are producing, what's the actual ROI, the revenue per employee that we're generating, the caveat here is, again, zero defect strategy will elevate that exponentially. So if you're not going back and reworking things, that revenue gets higher because your net is much better as a result. Employee satisfaction is one of those other things. If you look at agility, that's huge. We look at people primarily as one of our measures of progress and satisfaction. So it's important to measure what is that. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it costs a lot to train somebody and get them to that level. The last thing we want to do is get them to that level and have them bail and move on to another organization. So we would much rather keep them happy as well as move things through the funnel and generate that revenue. And then the last one, obviously, is customer satisfaction. So if customers aren't happy, they aren't buying. And if they're not buying, they're not talking about it. And then ultimately, if they're not talking about it, we don't have a place in the market. So it's important that all of those are measured in addition to the standard metrics. And there's operating metrics in DevOps, as well as quality metrics within the organization. So these are some of the focuses that we try to focus on early on in moving towards a value-based organization.
Great. In our follow-up conversations, we'll take a deeper dive on some of those metrics, but it's interesting what you're saying, Reed. I recently had a customer who was talking about value. They were asked to build a new internal customer facing site that would provide information on events that are occurring, different points of information for their employees to understand not just organizational tasks, but also future elements of hybrid workforce. So they spend this money, they deliver this site, and they consider it a success. But then
Right.
the executive asked, no one's really used it. Was there value out of the work we've put into place? And the question then became, was there value because we built and delivered on time within budget, or was there not value because no one's using the site? So this is something to consider.
Right.
And so speaking of that, I would love for you to tie for us before we end some of the best practices that you advocate to an example of real life organization that's kind of been a disruptor and taken a look at providing value to a customer.
So let's talk about a couple of things. So first of all, a great example of an organization that set itself up for phenomenal results. And an organization can change value overall through their products and services that they sell and market that differentiates them in the market. So if we look at those systems, both manual and automated, they're how they deliver products and services are changing dynamically. The great example is Carvana. So anyone that knows the implementation of Carvana in their first incarnation as they began, they were not profitable. But they're not trying to generate profit off of car sales. Their marketing is specifically geared towards finance. So when they're successful, they're financing as many of these cars as possible. They became a disruptor in a major way as lockdowns occurred and people couldn't go out. So not only was that unforeseen, they were set up and staged for something that now we see people are couch surfing and ordering things from home. The fact that you can do that with a car, not go down to the dealership, and you got a week to try it out and make sure, yeah, that works for me. Otherwise, no questions asked, you can take it back. So that is one of the biggest things that they set themselves up for. When we look at the value metrics that we're trying to look at, we're measuring efficiency within the organization. So those metrics are typically slanted towards IT. So both development and software deployment are part of that measure. But we need to measure the flow from ideation to delivery so that, and ultimately, as it gets adopted, we can measure those things. And all of that comes from a great book called Accelerate by John Kotter. And if we look at Kotter's model here, the first four pieces of a transformation are focused at the leadership or executive level. So any organization that short circuits this is not going to have long lasting change. So it's important to create that sense of urgency, to create that guiding coalition that's going to drive your transformation, and then get everybody excited and build that vision and strategy and communicate it out. If it's not coming top down, not as a mandate, but as an exciting transformation for the company, then ultimately what happens is you have that grassroots effort, which we've had historically, where teams are doing as much as they can, but they're being thwarted by middle and executive management because they're not doing the right things for transformation. So ultimately, we want to make sure that we set the organization up for success, but it's got to start with our leaders and our executives at top and work down so that those teams can be very successful and we don't have to reinvent the transformation again and again.
Absolutely. Thank you for that great example. And I think what you ended with really does talk about our next topic. When Reed and I meet next, we want to take a deeper dive. Reed just spoke to executive leadership. It starts there. A lot of the value conversation is occurring at that level
Right.
of how you change your operating model to determine value. How do you bring in principles from TBM, from product management principles, including value streams, value stream funding, from agile budgeting. So I hope you join us next time when we take a deeper dive. And I hope you gained something from listening to Reed and I speak about what value is. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Reed.
Thank you.